Your eyes do not deceive you as you look at the title. Yes, I have gone completely insane. I'm going to attempt to cover the entire plot of the Three Souls games in one video. Now, I just want to set some ground rules. By the way, I'm doing this before the Ring City expansion. People say, Argent, why are you doing it when that's going to come out in like a day or two? Because I can. Because I don't feel like waiting. And because I kind of have a timeline hammered out and I don't want it to be completely destroyed when I've spent time on it. So, just a few points before we get into this. I know I'm going to get a lot of things wrong, and they're going to be deliberately wrong. People say, well, why are you getting it deliberately wrong? Because the thing about the Dark Souls lore is a lot of it contradicts other parts of the lore. A lot of it's very vague. A lot of it's very open to interpretation. A lot of it is done by unreliable narrators. So you might be reading something that's a legend and it might be trying to imply something. The developers of this game are known trolls. They just insert hints and stuff to try to throw you off. You also have to understand that Dark Souls is supposed to be myth. If you haven't watched it, I'll try to remember to put a link in the video where I did my reaction review of Dark Souls 1, The Making of Modern Myth. And this is like not just mythos, but like an actual myth. And in mythic times, you can have a lot of things that are contradictory but true and are accepted. Like in some versions, Aphrodite is the sister of Zeus. In some versions, she's a titan. There's all these kind of different theories as to her origin. In some things, Kronos is the god of time, which from my understanding was developed because the Greeks got confused because the two words are so similar. As most people today get confused. In some, he's not the god of time. So you have all these things in myth, and people often don't have trouble accepting that they're ambiguous or that multiple understandings contradict one another. So I've made up a lot of stuff in this, and I've disregarded evidence in a lot of this, because what I'm trying to do is just to concoct a cohesive narrative. So I'm putting parsimony. For those of you who don't know, parsimony means feels right, makes sense, fits in. I'm placing that above strict interpretation of canon. So I'm just trying to tie everything together. So that being said, let's begin. So, as I was saying, Dark Souls is supposed to be myth. And most societies have a myth of a time before time, more or less. A time because traditionally most societies believed that the universe was infinite. That it always has been, that it always will be. And kind of before modern times started, there was an era where the world was just gray and unformed. In Norse mythology, if memory serves, the world was just a giant glacier and the ice giants were just there, kind of neither living nor dead. In Hinduism and the Vedas, they reference a great sea that covered the earth and that there was nothing other than water before things really started going. And you see this kind of throughout, that there's this time period of complete stasis before man emerges on the scene. So in Dark Souls, we start off with the upper world, as it were, being an infinite landscape of water and arch trees, and there the dragons are. Now, the dragons are described as being neither living nor dead, and they simply exist. Dragons are described as being immortal, that is, they can't die of old age so long as they possess their stone scales. Now, my personal interpretation is a dragon is something that a human or any other being becomes as kind of a form of nirvana. You've ceased turning the wheels of existence. You've become completely immortal. You don't need to keep coming back into this world. You don't have to keep dying and being reborn. You've completely transcended the cycle. You've transcended the circle of death and rebirth. So I see the dragons as kind of being a form of nirvana. So they govern the upper half of the world, and you had the people who lived in the world below. Now, my speculation is that Lost Izalith was where the the people who would eventually become the lords and humans lived. Whether or not the lords and humans were two distinct species, I'm not really sure, but they definitely are by the time of the Souls games. So roughly, it seems like there's three different species within the Souls games of kind of humanoids. You have humans, which are descended of the furtive pygmy. Now, I'm not sure if the pygmy was the only human or if they were kind of a subrace or a second race that lived together with the lords. I'm leaning towards them being kind of a subrace that were inferior to the lords, but that the distinctions between them really took off in the aftermath of the splitting of the soul. So they all lived in Lost Islet. So you have the lords, and I define lords as being the beings you see throughout the games who appear to be immortal, that is, they're ageless, and you can normally tell they're lords by their height. They range from like 7 to 12 to 15 feet, however tall. Like, if you look at the Silver Knights, they're definitely taller than an average human. Ornstein's a lot taller than an average human. They're kind of consistent. They tend to kind of be elven, very kind of slim and agile. So I view them as lords. Artorias is a lord. Ornstein is a lord. And then there's giants, which seem to be related to lords, but seem to be bigger. And we have the giant blacksmith. We have the giants that we have Yorm, and we have the giants that invaded Drangleic. So those are kind of the three main races. So as they were living underground, they resented those who were able to live up above in the great open spaces. So they came across the first flame. Now, I view the first flame as being kind of the world soul. The first flame, in its original state, was balanced between the four core aspects of creation: light and dark, life and death. And when they were all present within the first flame, it was stable, and the universe was more or less just eternal and peaceable. And what happened was, for whatever reason, three lords decided to break apart the first flame and take the lord souls out of it. Three of the four aspects of creation, whereas the fourth one, the furtive pygmy, took the fourth aspect of it, the darkness. I don't know if the lords just rejected darkness because it was antithetical to their nature. It's an interesting question, but by and large, I believe that they took it apart. They took apart the first flame. Now, an interesting piece of speculation would be if the primordial serpents told them to do this, because that would make sense. Because in Christianity, the world kind of existed in an eternal, non-changing, permanent status in the Garden of Eden. Man didn't really live or die. He just kind of existed. None of kind of the struggles, the gains and losses of life came about, and he had a simple faith in God, which particularly in Orthodox theology, the fall is ultimately seen as a good thing because it allows man to go from having a childish faith in God to having a adult faith in God through coming to faith, through struggle, through having to actually understand rather than just accepting as a child would. So we have that. So it could be seen that the primordial serpents, in kind of a positive manner, I mean, there can be the negative manner because the serpent is Satan that tempted humanity to eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that brought evil into the world. So it can be that, or the primordial serpents saw it as a way to start time and lead humanity and the lords to eventually become something greater. But regardless of whether or not the primordial serpents were involved, what their intent was, etc., the four lords split the first flame between them. The three lords split it between them. So then the gods rose to the surface and defeated the dragons. Once again, you can see this in Norse mythology with the gods defeating the frost giants, the Olympian gods defeating the titans, and I think it's in Hindu mythology as well. But this is fairly common that you have more human-like, more kind of anthropomorphic gods overthrowing something a bit more primordial. So they defeated the dragons, and they turned the world above into what we would kind of recognize as Earth. And then you had an era in which the gods ruled, and in which the world went through a great period of progress, technological development, cultural development, under the rule of the gods. And during this time period, Gwyn ruled as the king of the gods. I think you have to understand Gwyn is very much a Zeus-like figure. So maybe it's time to talk a bit about Gwyn's family. Now, I personally believe that... Now, Gwyn could have had a first wife who died. We aren't sure. I think kind of the simplest explanation is Gwyn's wife was Velka, as Velka statue resembles the statue of the kind of Virgin Mary-like figure holding the baby. And the baby is almost certainly the nameless king because his image has been destroyed pretty much everywhere. So I believe that Gwyn married Velka, and that Velka was one of the Chaos Witches, one of the daughters of the Witch of Islith, because she was another lord, and that she was also, it would cement an alliance between the two, I guess you could say, most powerful lords, who were kind of human, or kind of conscious and kind of involved with the world, because Nito just went back to sleeping. But the Witch of Islith and Gwyn were kind of autonomous beings, and I think he married her to cement the alliance. So I think she early on had 2 children. Once again, she could have had these children before the War of the Dragons, because they do refer to the Nameless King as being a dragon-slaying god of war. It's not particularly important, but so she bore the Nameless King, who I believe his name is Sen. You can look up that theory. But essentially because he was a god of war, and because he's associated with snake men, in Dark Souls 1 you have Sen's Fortress, which is clearly the royal armory, guarding the way to Anor Londo, and is populated by snake men. It's as good a name as any, so I'm just going to refer to him as Sen for the remainder of this video. So he had those 2 children, and the world was undergoing a age of peace and prosperity. However, the first flame began to fade over time because they had removed the various parts that kept it going. As it started to kind of languish, and I guess you can see this as a metaphor for entropy. The thing that was holding entropy at bay was kind of split apart. Gwyn came to the conclusion that if life was to continue, he would have to sacrifice himself and try to restore a bit of what is lost. I think ultimately that was kind of, and we'll get into this later, what Sen or the Nameless King was trying to do was restore the Age of Dragons and kind of reunite the various pieces of the First Flame. Because I think if they were all put back into the fire, it would basically restore the world, but we never get to see this happen. So Gwyn decided to cast himself onto the flame. So around the time he left, I believe what happened was Seath raped Velka. Now, why do I think Seath raped Velka? Because Gwyndolin is very clearly odd. He has those tentacles coming out of him. He is they kind of look serpentine, kind of dragon-like. It doesn't make sense that the child of 2 gods would look like Gwyndolin, that they would kind of be this deformed abomination. I mean, they might be an abomination, but they wouldn't be an abomination in that way. Now, some people say that Seath raped Gwyndolin, and that's possible, but I don't think that's the case, because Yorshka, who's pretty obviously Priscilla, refers to herself as being Gwyndolin's brother, not his nephew, not his niece. I guess she could have just been viewing him as a brother, but my view is that Velka was raped by Seath, which eventually caused her to flee, and she gave birth to twins. I think Gwyndolin and Priscilla are twins. They look similar in terms of kind of their dragon features, their hair color, etc. Plus, there's deference to Gwyndolin as being her brother in the third game. So I think Gwyndolin was born after Gwyn left, and he was brought up with tales of how great and mighty his father was. He was told about the Age of Fire. He was told about the other gods, etc. Now, I think personally, before Gwyndolin was born, maybe before Gwyndolin was born, the nameless king took the throne, and he was crowned king. He was Gwyn's successor. Now, this might have also happened when Gwyndolin was very young, but I think it's clear that Gwyndolin was not a adult when the gods left. So I think Sen became a god, and he became the king of the gods, and he noticed that his father's sacrifice hadn't actually fixed the problem. The cycle continued. The world would just run down again. The undead curse was still prevalent. The world was gradually slipping back into chaos. And he saw his position as being essentially worthless. He was the head of a dynasty that would just go down the same road. He would eventually have to cast himself on the bonfire. And there was no kind of permanent solution for anything. So I think what he thought is that the only time the world was basically whole and not slipping towards oblivion was the age of dragons. The dragons are immortal. The dragons live forever. And he wanted to bring back this great age of dragons. He wanted to basically escape the cycle of rebirth, death and rebirth, and kind of attain nirvana. As I've said, that's kind of how I view it, as becoming a dragon is basically being some form of nirvana. So, yeah. So we had that stuff happen. What else do we have? So he left to go and try and recreate the dragons. So I don't think he was exiled. Some people think he was exiled and stripped of his godhood. But when we see him in Dark Souls 3, even after years and years of fire have worn him down and reduced him into kind of a shadow of his former self, he's still very clearly a god. He's able to summon a massive storm you can stand on. He is much stronger in just the way he appears and the way he fights than Gwyndolin was in his prime when you fight him in Dark Souls 1. So I think by being stripped of his deific status, what they did was similar to what they did in Rome, where they damned his memory. His name was banned from being whispered. It was all his statues were cast down, and he was removed from the history books. And he left for Archdragon Peak. I think then Guinevere took the throne as the Queen of Sunlight, and she married Flann. However, the flame continued to fade, and she eventually decided to just flee, kind of like Mask of the Red Death, to escape the crumbling of Lordran, and to hopefully survive it, kind of like what Lothric would later do centuries later. So, why is the first flame fading so important? I think that darkness and light are kind of represent heaven and earth, or matter and essence. The lords are beings of pure essence. They possess inhuman beauty. They're smarter. They possess magical abilities, etc. But they're weak in terms of matter. They can only die once. They don't keep coming back to life. When the darkness becomes powerful and humans become tainted by the curse, they become much stronger physically. They can take incredible amounts of punishment, and they keep coming back to life after they die. Well, I think their essence and their form has severely decayed, hence how horrific they look. They have become, in essence, stronger than the lords. So as the first flame fades, and as the world kind of starts to slip towards disorder, I think it strengthens humanity at the cost of their minds and weakens the lords. So I think there's kind of a balance that needs to exist there between essence and substance, between form and being. So as it weakened, I think Guinevere fled for a land across the sea, as the lore suggests, and Gwyndolin was kind of left there with Seath and with his mother alone. So I think as kind of a young man, he was raised on, like I said, stories of his sister, of his father, of their glory. And he used his illusionary powers to hide his identity, to kind of hide what he looked like, to create an illusion of his sister, to create the illusion of the Silver Knights, to restore Anor Londo to what it had been before he was born. So it's very clear that Gwyndolin immensely idealizes his father, idealizes the past, idealizes the reign of the gods, and is kind of the inheritor of the legacy. I also think part of this comes from a desire to prove himself worthy, because he might subconsciously be aware that he's not actually Gwyn's son. As for Priscilla, I think Velka sealed her in the painted world out of fear that her daughter wouldn't be able to kind of survive and thrive in the world in the way her son was. Velka then, I think, took her leave and went into hiding, leaving Gwyndolin behind but watching over him because she despised Seath so much for raping her. So then eventually Gwyndolin came up with the whole curse system in sacrificing the undead as a way to prolong the first flame and to keep the legacy of his father alive forever. To kind of continue on where his father had failed, to prove himself a worthy heir for his father. So I think, I don't entirely understand how humanity and the curse work. I think that the bonfires are linked to the first flame, and if you feed humanity into the bonfires, it restores some of the light and restores a bit of your essence or form, and it makes you look human again. It doesn't affect your immortality or your strength, but it does restore your reason, your mind, and kind of your spirit, your consciousness. Humanity prevents hollowing, in which someone has entirely become consumed by the dark and has become completely immortal, but at the same time no longer possesses a mind and a soul of their own. So Gwyndolin basically set it up so that there would constantly be sacrifices to maintain his father's legacy. So then we enter the chosen undead, who's basically led into collecting the souls of the various lords. Now, why you collect the souls of the lords in the first game, I'm not sure. Why do you need to satiate the lord's soul? Is it because it's a key of sorts that Gwyn kind of decreed that to make it almost impossible to open the kiln of the first flame, that you needed the souls, like the cooperation of the other lords? Was it because the initial intent was to put all the lord souls back into the first flame and restore it, thus bringing an end to the cycle and restoring the world to how it was previously? We aren't really sure exactly why you need them, but you need them. So ultimately, I think the Chosen Undead did fight and defeat Gwyn. And I think the canonical ending of Dark Souls 1 is that the Chosen Undead refused to link himself to the First Flame and walked away to become a Lord of Darkness. However, Solaire did throw himself on the bonfire and restarted the cycle. So I think after the events of Dark Souls 1, the Chosen Undead, listening to Koth and believing that he could create an age and a kingdom of man free from the influence of the gods, took the Lord Vessel and fled with it across the sea. He came to Drangleic, which I believe is where the gods who had previously fled were hiding, where Guinevere and the rest of them were. And that's why we see all this Anor Londo-esque architecture. And we see kind of some enemies reminiscent of enemies from Lordran. I think the gods were in hiding there, and because the Chosen Undead was so strong, he was able to defeat them, and they fled back to Lordran, which by this point in time had largely recovered. He then shattered the Lord Vessel, and using the power of the great souls within it, was able to, I think he just kind of buried them or planted them around Drangleic, and he thought he could build an eternal kingdom by building his kingdom and linking it to the power of the Four Souls. It's fairly clear in Dark Souls 2 that, if not state atheism, religion was held in extremely low esteem by Drangleic, and at the very least, it was only paid lip service to, if not banned. They refer to the knights, as instance, as believing in strength and nothing else. They also refer to clerics as having very low social status in Drangleic and only tolerated out of kind of a memory. But yeah, we see other evidence of it being the gods having been there, because you have the Sunlight Altar, you have basically the copy of Anor Londo. I think there are silver and black knights in Dark Souls 2. God, I don't even really remember, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, so So Vendrick is actually the undead from the first game, and kind of what led up to the events of Dark Souls 2 is him doing everything possible to try to prolong his rule, to try to prolong the kingdom of man he had built, the kingdom of of that. And over time, I think once again the things kind of started to fade, things started to kind of fall apart. Although I find it interesting in Dark Souls 2 because the sun is rising, it's not setting like it is in the first two games. I guess in Dark Souls 1, the sun's setting, in 3, it's eclipsed, in 2, the sun is rising. So I don't know if that's supposed to mean that Drangleic has undergone an apocalypse and it's recovering. So I think what happened was the giants from across the sea were from the revived kingdom of Lordran, assumingly now called Lothric, and they were invading to try and get back the Vendrick's prize. Vendrick's prize being the Lord Vessel and the souls of the four great old ones. And they failed ultimately, but in the process, Drangleic was completely annihilated. And Vendrick, having his kingdom basically destroyed, desperately sought for ways to prolong and to escape the cycle. So he tried working with, I forget what his name was, Elda? Whatever his name was, to try to recreate dragons. He tried to marry Nashandra and to marry darkness and light together. He tried to use the souls of the old ones. He tried more or less everything he could. I think ultimately what the Throne of Want was it was to be like the last resort. That if all his other efforts failed, he would kind of create his own version of the First Flame to sustain his kingdom. I don't think the Throne of Want is the kiln of the First Flame. I think it's an attempt to replicate it, but I don't think it is. However, as the Shield of Want said, in the end he was no king. Let me try to find the description of the Shield of Want. Yes, in the end he was no king, and I think it refers to Vendrick because in the end he was unable to take the throne. However, as he had gone insane and his kind of power was fading and he refused to take the throne, I think ultimately out of fear that Nashandra would consume his powers and kind of restart the Age of Dark, he did come across the, was it marked one? Cursed one? Whoever he is in the undead in the second game. And seeing kind of someone who was marching in his footsteps and was kind of a worthy successor, he gave the only advice he could, the words that he had lived by: seek strength and the rest will follow. And I think that was more or less Vendrick's motto throughout his life, that he thought if he could become powerful enough, if he could gain enough strength, that he could escape the cycle, but ultimately he couldn't. So, I think that's more or less the end of Dark Souls 2. So now we're going to head into Dark Souls 3. So what happens as of Dark Souls 3? In Dark Souls 3, we abandon the fate of the first chosen undead and we go to the Unkindled one. What exactly the Unkindled are, I'm not entirely clear. I think it has something to do with Londor. I personally think that the Unkindled one was kind of a super weapon built by Londor for the purposes of finally putting their schemes into motion. So what do I think happened after the events of Dark Souls 2? So I think Guinevere and Flann returned to Lordran and rebuilt it into the Kingdom of Lothric. They might have changed their names. Gods often have a number of names that are not mutually exclusive. So I think it's possible Guinevere changed her name to Rosaria and that Flann changed his name to Osiris. Or if that's just a name they adopt that people gave them over time, etc. But I think they returned it and ruled Lothric, and essentially what they wound up doing was they produced a stream of children who were fed into the first flame in order to continue their kingdom of light indefinitely. So I think that just kept going, and there were kind of other figures like Jormund Ludlow, or however you pronounce his name, who were also became Lords of Cinder. And it's very clear that the chief kind of focus of the Kingdom of Lothric is to keep the flame burning forever. However, once again, as the fire began to fade, I think they gave birth to two children, Lothric and Lorien. And Lothric was extremely weak probably not even able to prolong the flame very long, and it was starting to look like it was near the end. However, Lothric refused to link the flame, so I think Lorien took his place. Lorien linked the first flame, and it burned out his godhood and most of his powers, and he's just kind of an idiot now, his essence being more or less shattered. So while this was happening, I think after Lorien, or when he was burning the first flame and the power of the gods was really starting to wane, you had a right and proper cleric named Eldritch, who began to have apocalyptic visions of a coming age of the Great Sea. Now, this is very common in apocalyptic literature, to have this idea of the world becoming water. We have this in the Bible with Noah's Ark and God destroying the earth with a big flood. You have Savonarola believing that a great flood would come and cleanse the world. This appears just in a lot of different mythology as something apocalyptic people believe in, because water is a cleansing agent. So in order to kind of bring this about, Eldritch needed an immense amount of power. So what he began to do was to consume other people. He would drain their power. Now, I have a theory that there's absolutely no basis for, but that kind of the way the cult worked was Eldritch claimed to be offering salvation and godhood, because he would devour people and their essence would become part of him. So in a sense, by eating people, they would become part of a god, because Eldritch eventually became a god through might. So Eldritch had this huge cult, and he decided to wage war on the gods. So I think what wound up happening was he ate Gwyndolin outright. He largely devoured Guinevere, and the Huskifer became Rosaria. And he devoured some of Flaan's powers, enough to kind of make him into a normal lord, or take away most of his deific status. And, however, Eldritch was eventually defeated. Now, whether it was a last alliance of elves and men, whether the Nameless King came out of retirement briefly to kick his ass, we don't know. What we do know is that Eldritch was basically forced to link the first flame, and he prolonged it for probably a very long time, because he might have been one of the most powerful beings to ever exist in the Souls universe, just from how much he had consumed. So he was basically left a ruined wreck of what he used to be. So around this time, King Osiris became obsessed with regaining his god status. So the person who was most interested in basically becoming immortal and a god was Seth. So Flaan, or now Osiris, went to the Duke's archives and began furiously researching how to become a dragon, how to become a god again. And what wound up happening was, during his experiments, he went crazy, and the experiments backfired, and kind of like Pinwheel in the first game, his attempt to thwart the course of nature turned him into an abomination. This led Lothric to take the throne at last, as being more or less the last of the gods, the rest of the divine family either being rendered incapacitated or just basically dead at this point. I think Lothric harbored immense hatred towards the old gods and towards his parents. Because of their selfishness, his brother, who was the only person he loved, had been reduced to just a husk of what he used to be. The being who was closest to him in the world was gone because of their obsession with keeping the first flame alive. Eldritch had killed the elder gods. The kingdom was in ruins because of the various religious conflicts, etc. So I think Lothric, in kind of his despair and anger at the first flame, also his parents' attempt to force him to sacrifice himself to it, made him implement some form of state atheism, where he tried to ban the worship of the gods. And he tried to suppress religion in general out of resentment. So this brings us to the issue of the angels in the Civil War. Now, where did the angels come from? Initially, people thought that the angels were kind of a reactionary movement attempting to restore the belief in the old gods. But from what I've heard about the DLC and just in general, the angels appear to be hollows who have kind of transcended and become beings of light. It's said that the pilgrims, that the kind of the shells on their backs burst open and they become butterflies and eventually become full angels. So I think what might have happened is in the first game, after New Londor had kind of collapsed, New Londo had collapsed, and the dark race had started running around. I think Kath calls them heretics or people who failed him, something to that effect. So I think they were kind of imperfect versions of what he wanted, and he kind of withdrawed with his most loyal followers and created the Kingdom of Londor to wait until the gods were vulnerable. So I think what happened at this point was they dispatched the pilgrims to Lothric, and the pilgrims eventually became changed into angels, and they started spreading the angelic faith, and the people who no longer had anything to believe in took to it. In particular, they came to Gertrude, one of the last children of Guinevere and Flann, and were able to convert her to the angelic faith. And she led an uprising against her brother's rule, which resulted in a civil war. And angelhood and kind of the power of the angels is a blessing offered to people who kind of embrace their hollow nature. So I think what the Sable Church of Londor does is they believe that rather than being evil, darkness and matter are a good thing. That that it's not just essence that's good, but substance is also good as well. So I think they believe that the dark sign, because it grants humans immortality and immunity to death, is actually a blessing, that the curse is actually a good thing. But what needs to happen is they need to give salvation to the undead by allowing them to keep their form, allowing them to keep their, I guess, human appearance and their human minds and their souls. And that was kind of their ultimate goal. I think there's a Christian parallel with the Sable Church of Londor, that it's supposed to be offering kind of permanent salvation. It's supposed to be kind of one death is the end, that kind of thing, instead of an endless stream of deaths. And they use kind of more Christian appearance. They kind of look like, the few people you see kind of look like nuns. And what's her name? Sister Freyde, or whatever her name is, has a rosary and dresses as a nun, more or less. So I think they sent the pilgrims to Lothric, and they initiated the Civil War. And the Civil War ended in a draw. And Lothric just basically gave up, took his remaining loyal soldiers, and left to watch the world fall apart in glee. Because everything he had ever loved had basically been destroyed. He'd lost his kingdom, he'd lost his brother's mind, and the only move he had left was basically to throw himself on the first flame, which he refused to do. So I think what happens in Dark Souls 3 is the bell chimes showing that the first flame is about dead. I think it spits out the Lords of Cinder as kind of a test, that only someone able to beat the Lords of Cinder is strong enough to link the first flame. I think the Ashen One, or the Unkindled One, was sent by Londor without his memories to be a super weapon, to more or less defeat the Lords of Cinder, and to open the kiln of the first flame, and to go and fulfill their ultimate goal. So I think their ultimate goal was the usurpation of fire ending. So rather than just rekindle the flame, the Ashen One was able to take it into himself, to become fully darkness and fully light, fully man and fully divine. It's kind of a theme you have in the Bible, where you have a bridge between godhood and humanity. God becomes a man in the form of Jesus to act as a bridge between the two. The priest takes the bread and wine into himself and acts as a conduit between the divine and man. So by taking the first flame, which kind of represents light, into himself, and being the Lord of Hollows, which represents darkness, the chosen undead is able to, the Ashen One is able to completely fulfill the ultimate purpose of the Sable Church and combine both. The undead have now become, much like they will at the final resurrection, perfect in both form and substance. They're completely immortal, but they will also never lose their minds, and they will never lose kind of the beauty of their bodies. History has kind of come to an end, but it's come to an end in a better way than it was before. There will truly be an age of utopia and humanity now, as humans have been perfected, which is kind of what happens at the end of the Bible. Our faith teaches that humans aren't meant to exist as pure mind nor as pure body, but there's supposed to be a balance between the two. So the Lords are wrong by thinking all that needs to exist is the soul and the mind, and then that's the core of being. And a lot of humans are wrong in thinking that all that matters is the body, and that the higher realms don't. So by linking them together, humanity is finally able to achieve its true form and has kind of become free of the need of the gods. Now, whether or not they believe in some creator deity or in heaven or something else, we don't really know. We don't know a ton about their specific beliefs. But I think the ending, the Usurp the Fire ending, is supposed to represent, at least, and once again, this is all speculation. This is all just me imposing what I think is a coherent narrative on the whole thing. The Last Judgment, the final reconciliation of man and godhood, and kind of the happy end of kind of the cycle. And I think it's clear the Nameless King failed to resurrect the dragons, and he's once again become a shell of his former self. So that's my theory as to the plot line of the Souls games. That's my attempt to explain it. That's my attempt to, I guess, kind of just establish everything, to provide a coherent narrative that has it like a timeline. I know I ignored a lot of stuff. I know I made a lot of stuff up. I know I fudged a lot of things, but I think at least that was interesting. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Definitely I will check out the DLC when it came out, and everybody have a good day.